You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C. And so, by popular demand, I think it'll be not too surprising to our listeners that we will be talking about the new alliance in Asia, or really the old new alliance in Asia, which is the newly announced Australia, UK, United States arrangement, known by its acronym of AUKUS, which I'm still getting used to saying out loud, but I'm sure I'll get more acclimated to it with time. But before we get into our chat today, I do want to introduce our guest, who should be familiar to some of our listeners, given that he's a returner, Ashley Townshend, joining us from Sydney, where he's at the United States Studies Center, follows all things Indo-Pacific, all things U.S.-Australia quite closely. So, Ash, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ankit.
Pleasure to have you. I'm sure you've had quite your fill of talking about AUKUS at this point, but I'm hoping that we can dig into things a little bit more. And, the benefit of doing this podcast a little bit more than a week and a half since the original announcement is that we have slightly more details than we did at the start. But, let me just begin by just laying out the groundwork on what exactly AUKUS is. It's a new trilateral partnership between two countries that were U.S. allies before this announcement. Now it's a formally trilateral cooperative arrangement. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have, of course, heard about the banner AUKUS outcome, which is plans for Australia to acquire a nuclear-propelled submarine at some point in the future, probably in the early 2040s, if we're being realistic, but official plans potentially envisage something coming in sooner. But I do want to emphasize, Ash, and this is perhaps a good place to begin our conversation, which is that there's a lot more to this arrangement. It's not just the three countries getting together and coming down with this idea of Australia acquiring SSNs, as nuclear-propelled submarines are known for short. But tell us a little bit about the contours of the AUKUS arrangement. What exactly is being offered up here to Australia, and what does Australia gain out of AUKUS?
That's a great place to start, Ankit, because it's true that AUKUS is being called an alliance, and that's a term that I think gets used far too easily in a range of contexts these days. But AUKUS is not an alliance. Formally, it's called a trilateral security partnership, but they've even added the word enhanced in front of trilateral to signify that nothing here is really altogether new. The new goodie for Australia really is that we will have access, as you say, to US nuclear propulsion technology for future submarines. But beyond that, the AUKUS arrangement is really designed to be a framework for closer defense and defense industrial technology sharing between the three countries. And in that sense, AUKUS builds on a lot of what has been happening slowly in the past, although I would wager hasn't been happening particularly well when it comes to bringing Australia and the United Kingdom into the US National Technology and Industrial Base, which was a 2017 decision by the United States, which was designed really to try and find a way to create, at the end of the day, a defense-free trade zone, but really to integrate the niche industrial and technology capabilities, potential for them, science and technology processes, and so forth, between all three countries, so that we had a larger and therefore more active and more potentially competitive defense technology industrial base when compared with that the Chinese have and are expanding on quickly. So look, that's I think the context for it. AUKUS has been put to me by a number of Australians as being a way for Australia to go shopping, to
Right.
co-develop products with the UK and the US, but to go shopping for the kinds of capabilities that we haven't got that we believe we may need in the future. And they will touch on a range of sort of areas of critical and emerging technology, from cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, and so forth, with the submarines being the piece of that got the headlines.
Right. And I mean, just to go over the fact sheets that have been released so far, and just to put it in specific terms for listeners, right? We have everything from quantum technologies, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, cooperation, Australia purchasing long-range missiles, setting up its own sovereign industrial base to build long-range weaponry, standoff capabilities to bring to the conventional fight in Asia in the future. So there's a lot here. I mean, Ash, the next
And
question.
everything
Yeah.
that you just mentioned there, Ankit, just to jump in,
Yeah.
is not necessarily coming through AUKUS, nor does it necessarily require it. Australia, prior to the establishment of AUKUS, at last year's AUSMIN, was really keen on US support for the establishment
Mhm.
of our own sovereign capability to manufacture long-range missiles here. And there have been previous examples of co-development in the hypersonic space that's already ongoing. So AUKUS will allow us, if all goes to plan, to do that just a lot better.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that word you emphasized at the start, the enhanced component of this cooperation is, I think, quite significant. Because at this point, if we'd been having this conversation a few months ago or last year, I mean, the last time I had you on the show, we were talking about the Defense Strategic Update, and that's absolutely right that this is really an extension of where strategic thinking was already going in Australia.
Absolutely.
But in a sense, what AUKUS does, at least from where I'm sitting, is it heightens the ceiling of where this cooperation can go, and I think that's quite significant. And look, we've already talked for a few minutes without really talking about submarines in details, but let's go a little bit longer on this point because I wanted to sort of draw out that point that I just raised about this being more sort of a demonstration of continuity in Australian strategic thought than anything else. And you wrote an article for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that I read and I recommend to our listeners that really puts this in context and I think ties it back to what we discussed last time you were on the podcast with the Defense Strategic Update. So tell us a little bit about the bigger geopolitical picture here, right? Shifting threat perceptions in Australia, difficult relations with China, a shifting assessment of the conventional deterrence challenges to come in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years. So where does this come from then when it when we look at the discussions that are happening in Canberra? Because American officials have said AUKUS was primarily an Australian idea. The US and the UK were happy to go along given the strength of the alliance, but really the genesis of this concept came from Canberra.
No, that's exactly right, and you are 100% correct to couch the entire AUKUS developments and also the other announcements around US force posture initiatives that got little attention by comparison that came through at the 2+2 meeting in Washington the other week. In the broader framework of Australia's 2020 Defence Strategic Update, I would go even further back and say that really all of this begins in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. But to keep it simple, both of those strategic documents from an Australian perspective, did a couple of things. First, at increasing levels of anxiety, they argued that the strategic environment in Asia was rapidly deteriorating, and that one way or another, the United States by itself would no longer be able to uphold that a strategic order by itself, and that therefore Australia and other like-minded, capable and committed regional partners would need to do increasingly more in order to build out the capacity to uphold a favourable balance of power. So the way I like to put this is that Australia, for the last 4 or 5 years, has been on a trajectory towards willingly taking part in a collective balance of power strategy for the future of Indo-Pacific order. The Defence Strategic Update took that to another level by really arguing that Australia would need to acquire the capabilities not just to shape the strategic environment, which is a piece that I still don't think we're necessarily doing enough in, but to deter and respond at a high-intensity military level in the future to Chinese power, both independently, but also in coalitions, including through the US alliance, but also with the new regional architecture that is emerging in the defense space, most importantly, the trilateral with Japan and the Quad. The defense update, of course, doesn't name China specifically in those terms, but it was a document that was very transparent on that point. The key thing about the alliance and the pursuit by Australia of a collective balance of power strategy in the region is that Australia needs the alliance in order to empower us to be independently able to contribute more effectively to that strategic future that we envisage. And by that I mean Australia needs technology transfer, it needs technical know-how, it needs investment in posture here on the continent in order to bulk out our strategic capacity for action in terms of military power, but also in terms of our logistics sustainment base and frankly technical industrial base in a personnel sense. AUKUS will allow us to start to do those things more quickly. It will allow us to do them trilaterally with the Brits and the Americans to take existing partnerships to another level. But above all of this, I think the key point is that Australia is repositioning itself in terms of its strategic personality and in terms of the contribution that it is willing to make to balance of power politics in the region in a fairly dramatic way, and in a way that we haven't really seen at least since the 1960s.
Yeah, and I think also on the U.S. side, at least here in Washington, I mean, we do see a fundamental shift in both Democrats and Republicans, I think, coming around the notion that the U.S. needs to do more to empower its allies, primarily because, I mean, not just because of the inability of the United States to carry all of the burdens of maintaining a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region all on our own, but it's not just Australia. I mean, I think AUKUS is the best example so far in the Biden era of this sort of thinking. But you can look at the scrapping of the revised missile guidelines with South Korea, continued support for Japan developing an autonomous strike capability itself, and you start to see this picture really come together across the region. Okay, I mean, we went about 10 minutes, but now, let's get to those submarines. Let's talk a little bit about the SSNs that have been getting all the headlines. And of course, the elephant in the room, who we haven't mentioned yet, is the French. Of course, there is no such thing as a free lunch in geopolitics, and the French, unfortunately, got the rough side of this deal in many ways. Although, I am slightly sympathetic to the French case, given that the August 30th joint statement at the 2+2 did mention how much Australia and France were looking forward to their mutual cooperation on the future submarine project. And just for listeners, very quickly to provide context, we don't have to go into the details. Australia was due to purchase conventionally powered submarines from France, which was a decision taken as part of the Collins-class replacement project after a competition in which Germany, Japan, and France were the finalists. That decision was ultimately scrapped through AUKUS, and there's a variety of reasons we can go into that. Domestic politics, cost overruns, a fundamental reassessment of the utility of conventional submarines in the waters of the Indo-Pacific. But Ash, tell us a little bit here in practical terms. What do nuclear propulsion submarines bring to the table here for Australia?
We've got to go back to the point about the strategic environment deteriorating more quickly than government anticipated, and the French submarine deal, although it's not quite as long as this, really goes back to almost a decade of wrangling in Australia over how it's going to replace the Collins class and how it's going to prepare for a much more contested regional order. And it seems that really decisions Canberra has taken time and time again have been mugged by reality, leading to a step up in this case of a technology choice by successive governments. So when it comes to the choice now to acquire nuclear propulsion for our submarines, I think it really comes down to those things that will be familiar to most of your listeners. The fact that nuclear powered submarines will allow Australia to traverse much greater distances in the Indo-Pacific. They will allow Australia to be much more survivable in a contested regional order, and they will also allow Australia to pack greater lethality onto its platforms, both in terms of the payloads that they can carry, the way that they can support, of course, also intelligence, special operations, and so forth. The key point, I think, for Australia, though, in stating all of those points is this: Australia became convinced that conventionally powered submarines that had to surface in order to recharge their batteries intermittently and had to return to Australia to refuel at much greater frequency, they wouldn't allow Australia to spend the time on station, that is the time on operations, in parts of the region where Australia feels it will probably need to spend a lot of time in the future, that being principally the South China Sea and the littoral environment in Southeast Asia that sort of frame Australia's northern approaches, but also further afield, potentially as far north as the first island chain, the northern part of that. Obviously, people like to talk about Taiwan. I don't want to be misinterpreted by saying that Australia's decision here is motivated by our decision to be as useful as possible in a Taiwan contingency. That's not the case here. The calculations have much more to do with the forward defence perimeter, if you like, that Australia has reset in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update in littoral and maritime Southeast Asia. But of course, it is also true to say that nuclear-powered submarines would allow Australia to bring more to a Northeast Asian fight than conventionally powered submarines would. So bottom line here, it gives Australia more options, but it gives Australia more capacity to spend time defending the waterways and potentially imposing costs on Chinese forces were they to embark on aggression in those waterways further to Australia's north for longer and in a safer way.
So when we talk about the Royal Australian Navy's nuclear propulsion submarines, we're of course talking about a fairly distant future, a future in which you and I will both be older and wiser. And the only reason I bring that up is a lot of the debates that we have around requirements for force posture in the Indo-Pacific and the United States, conventional deterrence concerns, are fundamentally concerned with short-term challenges. The 2020s, the early 2030s, And I mean, just to clarify for listeners, if Australia had proceeded with the French conventional submarines, those would have probably arrived by the mid 2030s, assuming no further delays or cost overruns. The nuclear propulsion submarines, end of the 2030s in the most optimistic projections at the moment. More realistically, probably early 2040s. So that gives a lot of time for things to go very wrong in the Indo-Pacific, particularly given what we've seen from Xi Jinping's China. So, Ash, I mean, let me put this other question to you, right? I mean, so people have made the case here. So there's sort of two sides of AUKUS criticism that I just want to broadly get at, right? On the one hand, you sort of have the non-proliferation critique, which we're not going to get into here just because it's a very technical debate that requires getting into the details of the international safeguard system for highly enriched uranium. We also just don't have a lot of details at this point because the next 12 to 18 months will be the period in which the three AUKUS countries figure out how exactly this is going to work in sort of legal and practical terms. But then on the other side of the ledger, you have folks really making the case that Canberra's Australian dollars would have been much better spent on a different package of platforms, right? It's fine and good that Australia is going to be buying Tomahawks and, investing in AI, ISR systems, cyber capabilities. A lot of that could manifest in the 2020s. But unmanned undersea vehicles, surface warships, increasing lethality in other ways. So how do sort of you make sense of that, right? I mean, because you just can't get around this issue that these boats aren't going to be in the water for a very long time. Do you think that, I mean, just in terms of, your views as an analyst, I mean, was this really the best way for Australia to go with this decision? Or do you think that there might have been other investments that could have made more sense in the short term?
Without adopting Chinese talking points here, I don't think it's appropriate necessarily to place these choices as binaries, right? When we're looking at the decision to acquire the best possible submarine capability for the future, for the replacement of an existing capability, and that legacy system that will exist and be operational through at least to the late 2030s. On the one hand, and on the other hand, investing in other new, more quickly accessible and more quickly operational capabilities. They're not binary choices. Australia is looking at options for underwater autonomous vehicles. Australia is looking and building capabilities here in country in autonomous aerial vehicles, right? I think the Loyal Wingman program that Lockheed and the Royal Australian Air Force is undertaking in Queensland is a great example of that. There are a range of other programs, and certainly there's a range of other capability options that are being looked at by government that were flagged last year in the Force Structure Plan that will see other things happen in the long 2 decades before these submarines become operational. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, what is Australia's strategy for managing the gap, the 2020s, 2030s gap between when these real high-end capabilities come online for under Australian sovereign control? I think there you need to look at the force posture initiatives, the way that Australia is looking to support the strongest possible forward US military presence in the Indo-Pacific, which is really a phrase that has been used in Australian white papers going back years and years, but really now putting meat on that bone. The AUSMIN meeting in Washington 10 days ago, again, as I said before, a lot of this was overlooked, but flagged that the United States and Australia will embark on a whole range of new land, air, and sea basing arrangements, including sustainment arrangements for submarine and surface ships of allied countries, including the United States and Britain. We suspect, and of course, we also suspect, including the more frequent visiting to Australia of US nuclear powered submarines, and in the interim, or at some point in the next later this decade, the capacity for those submarines to be maintained and serviced in a much deeper way here in Australia. That could also be extended to the Brits, and people are also talking about leasing arrangements, or at least sort of teaming arrangements that would see Australian personnel either on board with for educational purposes and training purposes, as well as for operational purposes, US and British submarines to learn the ropes in this long intervening period. So there are arrangements in place, I think, there that we will see more of as we work out how we're going to go ahead with this program.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Sorry, go.
Okay, so I just wanted to pivot a little bit now, just before we run out of time on this episode, to talk a little bit about the regional reaction. Right, so obviously the reaction from Beijing has been quite predictable. Cold War thinking, blocs and alliances, trying to contain China and so forth. But the reaction from Southeast Asia has been quite notable, I think. With obviously there are a variety of views on the so-called great power competition in the Indo-Pacific among the member states of ASEAN. But Indonesia, an important diplomatic partner for Australia, for instance, was, I think it's fair to say, a little bit concerned in with regard to what exactly AUKUS represented. And I'm sure this is going to occupy a lot of diplomatic energy for Australia in the coming months and years, particularly over this next 18-month period, as the details on the SSN program are being hammered out. What's your sense about the right way in which Australia should be approaching Southeast Asian partners on AUKUS and sort of the significance of this new arrangement?
So there are a number of ways of getting after that question, Ankit. I think the first, and to highlight my colleague Susanna Patton's work on this, the first is that Australia does need to take Southeast Asian reactions seriously and not assume that it's necessarily comes down to posturing for domestic consumption or wanting to be seen by China or others to oppose or to be cautious about the AUKUS arrangement and the nuclear-powered submarines that we're acquiring, and to actually take those concerns at face value and understand them and not dismiss them. That's important because for Australia, and going back to the 2020 defence update, Southeast Asia is, if you like, our first island chain. It's the perimeter of Australia's forward defence line in the region, and for Australia, it is the sovereignty, the stability of that region that will be integral, we think, to our security. And so the character of regional order there matters. If countries in the region view Australia as not inclusive or view Australia as pursuing things without their consent is the wrong word, but their knowledge and buy-in, then that will be problematic for us in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second point is that there is no single ASEAN view on this. We've obviously seen some real concern expressed by Malaysia, to a lesser extent Indonesia, but on the flip side, we've seen quite significant endorsement from the Philippines and at least cautious endorsement from Singapore. So once again, there is no ASEAN position on this issue, as is the case with so many issues in regional security. That's not surprising. I think that gets us to the third point, which is that Australia always needs to do its due diligence and its consultation processes as early as possible and as deeply as possible when it comes to engaging with the region. Now, Australia did that really well last year when it announced a much more forward-leaning defence update, and broadly speaking, the region endorsed that in many cases publicly. Of course, that wasn't possible with this AUKUS arrangement, given the stakes, given the fact that we were pulling out of an existing deal with the French and so forth. That kind of warning was not possible. So I think it's incumbent on Australia now to make sure that there is a very, very detailed process of consultation to ensure that regional countries understand the motivations there. But I think that they do, in many cases at least. And the one point that I'll end with here is this. 20 years ago, it wouldn't necessarily have been the case that this sort of move by Australia wouldn't be viewed as intimidating, potentially directed towards countries in the region, potentially Indonesia being at the top of that list. That is not the case anymore. So regional countries may have concerns with the way they've been consulted, with the way that Australian actions might contribute to a broader deterioration in a regional security environment, but they don't anymore view this as Australia potentially looking to find its security from them. It's
Right.
a way that Australia contributes to the security of the region, and how it does that, which is the issue. That signals a lot of progress.
And so before we close out, Ash, I have to ask you about France. Right? I mean, the French are obviously, I think it's well known to all of our listeners, given that's really been, I think, at least here in the United States, I've been quite shocked to see just how big the story became. I mean, people who really take no interest in Asian geopolitics have been asking me, what's going on between France and Australia. The French see themselves as a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. They like to repeatedly highlight that they have the most exclusive economic zone of any external power. Important partner for Australia, of course, before all of this went down. Important partner for the United States, for the UK, for obviously the most forward-leaning EU country in the region. How do you patch things up at this point?
So the first point I think is to just reiterate the obvious, which is because AUKUS is not about strategic policy, it's not actually about the way we align with other countries and do things in the region. It's about a technical a means to purchase equipment. It's a defense technology partnership. It doesn't signal that Australia wants to do any more or any less with France as we were before. I think that's an important point. It might sound a bit like a defensive talking point from someone in Australia, of course, but it's an important point because Australia's decision here was motivated primarily by the capabilities in question, and as a secondary part of that, the fact that the French submarine program was already nearly dead in the water. It was the worst kept secret in Australia that that particular program was not going to exist or continue to exist in its current form. What the replacement would be and how Australia was going to get out of that was very much open to question. We now know why there was so much secrecy surrounding those discussions and options, but the French submarine program was not going to continue. It was incumbent on Australia to find an alternative, and I think that that does need to be remembered. The second point here that I would make is that there has been enormous progress with regards to Australia-France cooperation and partnership in the Indo-Pacific, and more broadly with Australia and European countries. Speaking personally, at the same, on these matters, though, it's not necessarily clear to many of us here in Australia what that cooperation will mean in practice when it comes to accepting cost and risk in the Indo-Pacific. Now, when it comes to the way that European partners can work with Australia to contribute to capacity building in the region, to contribute regional governance and diplomacy, to contribute to things like technical standards and global forums and so forth, there is a very, very important and growing work agenda. But when it comes to the way that, for example, that Australia, Japan, and the United States are trying to work together at a military level, the way that the US and Australia work together on intelligence cooperation, the way that we are increasingly trying to integrate not just our talking points about the region, but the way that we could potentially fight a major war in Asia, that to me doesn't seem like the role for Europe here. So I think that that also needs to be borne in mind that the way Europe engages in the Indo-Pacific may not be on every single issue, and that that's okay. There is certainly value in those other issues, and that is perhaps where we should be investing the most of our attention going forward.
Excellent. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for joining me today to really help make sense of the finer points of AUKUS. And, I am really glad that we spent most of the time talking not about the submarines, but really about the broader significance here. I think there'll actually be a lot more to say about the submarines once we're, well into this 12 to 18 month period and we start getting details about capabilities, timelines, infrastructure, supporting infrastructure in Australia. At least what I've been able to tell so far is that a lot of that needs to be worked out. But we do have a high-level announcement,
Right.
and I think it's particularly notable to see this coming out in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's the administration really, I think, showing that they are going to try to make good on this notion of the Indo-Pacific being the priority theater for the United States. But I'm sure there'll be a lot more to say on AUKUS in the coming months and years. But thanks a lot for joining me, and I hope you'll be back soon.
Thanks, Ankit. Been a pleasure.
Excellent. For listeners, make sure you subscribe so you can catch up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. In the meantime, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.